It was a typical afternoon at the playground. Children laughing, swings creaking in the breeze. But then a gunshot shattered the peace. My daughter, my little girl, collapsed, shot. And the one who did it? HOA Karen. What happened next will leave you speechless. Keep watching to see how this nightmare unfolded and the shocking truth that followed. Before we dive into this shocking and emotional story, I need to ask, where are you watching from? Drop your city's name in the comments below. I'm always curious about where my videos are reaching. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the intense stories I'll be sharing. Now, let me take you to the moment that changed everything. It was a bright afternoon when I decided to take my daughter to the park. She loved the swings more than anything, and I loved watching her smile as she soared higher and higher. She's my little fighter, and despite her challenges, she had a joy in life that made everything seem brighter. But that day, everything changed. We weren't alone. HOA Karen, always the overbearing, self-righteous figure in our neighborhood, was there too. I'd had my run-ins with her before, but never like this. I had no idea how it would all unfold. Before I could even react, I heard the shot, a loud crack that cut through the peaceful scene. My daughter's scream echoed in my ears as she collapsed on the ground, blood pooling around her. The person who did this? Karen. You're probably wondering what happened next. Trust me, it gets worse before it gets better. Stay with me. The park was a picture of serenity. The kind of peaceful afternoon you'd wish for every time you stepped outside with your child. The laughter of children echoed through the air, a sweet sound of innocence, while the gentle swaying of the swings and the rustling of leaves in the breeze created the perfect backdrop. Emma was on her favorite swing, her giggles rising and falling with each push. Her face was illuminated by the warmth of the sun, her eyes sparkling with joy as she soared higher and higher, a carefree smile stretching across her face. I was watching her, soaking in every moment, thinking how lucky I was to witness her happiness, thinking how simple and perfect life felt at that moment. After everything we'd been through together, after all the struggles and hurdles, it was these moments, these quiet, ordinary moments, that made me feel like everything was going to be okay. But then something shifted, a subtle change in the air, a feeling I couldn't quite place but couldn't ignore. It wasn't a sound nor a specific thing I could put my finger on. It was the way the light seemed to change, the way the laughter in the park seemed to fade into the background, like it was being swallowed by something darker. I turned my gaze over to the side of the playground where I saw her, Karen, the HOA president. I had known her for years, and her presence was always a source of tension, but today, something felt different. She was standing still at the far end of the park, watching us, her posture rigid and tense. There was something in the way she stood, the way her eyes focused on Emma, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I had always known she was a controlling person, someone who liked to impose her will on everyone around her, but I had never thought she was capable of this. Of what? I couldn't yet understand what my gut was telling me. I tried to shake off the unease that crept into my chest. There was no reason to be suspicious, right? I turned my attention back to Emma, pushing her on the swing a little higher, watching as her face lit up with pure joy. Her laughter, so innocent, so full of life, was contagious, and for a second, I allowed myself to forget the dark feeling that had settled over me. She was happy, and that was all that mattered in that moment. But then, that nagging feeling, the one I had tried to ignore, grew stronger. Something was wrong. It was a feeling I couldn't shake. I glanced back toward Karen, and this time my stomach churned. She hadn't moved. She was still standing there, staring at us. Her eyes were locked on Emma now, and the coldness in her gaze sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the usual disapproving stare I had come to expect. This was something deeper, something unsettling. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively took a step closer to Emma, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. But before I could act on the unease that gripped me, before I could fully process what I was feeling, it happened. A sound, a loud, deafening bang. The kind of sound you hear in a movie, but never think you'll hear in real life. The kind of sound that shatters everything, that rips the safety net of the world away from beneath you in an instant. The gunshot echoed across the park, the sound sharp and unrelenting. My heart froze in my chest, my whole body locked in place for a split second. Then everything erupted into chaos. I whipped around toward Emma. My blood ran cold. She was on the ground. I couldn't process what I was seeing at first. I couldn't believe it. She had been laughing, she had been swinging just seconds ago, and now she was lying motionless on the ground. The vibrant, joyful girl I had just been pushing on the swing was gone, replaced by something terrifyingly real. Blood. Her blood was spreading out from beneath her. Her small frame was crumpled in a way no child's body should ever be. I felt the world spin, a sense of unreality creeping in. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't happening. But it was. My daughter. She had been shot. I rushed toward her. But it felt like I was moving in slow motion, like everything around me was happening at a distance, as though I wasn't truly a part of it. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short gasps as I reached her side. Her cries filled my ears, a sound that ripped through me. But in the midst of it all, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the blood pooling around her tiny body, the fear in her eyes as she struggled to breathe. "Mom, I can't breathe." Her voice was so weak, so fragile. It was the worst sound I had ever heard in my life. My hands were shaking as I tried to comfort her, as I tried to keep her still, as I tried to make sense of what was happening. "Emma, honey, stay with me. Stay with me. Please," I begged, my voice thick with panic. Her eyes fluttered, and her small chest heaved as she gasped for air. The world around me felt like it was closing in, like I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't the life I had promised her. I was supposed to keep her safe. And now, in this moment, I felt powerless. I could hear the others in the park, the sounds of people running toward us, calling for help, their voices distant, muffled by the pounding in my ears. But there was only one thing that mattered. Emma, my baby girl. I fumbled for my phone, my hands slick with sweat as I dialed 911, the numbers blurring on the screen. My heart was racing, my thoughts a whirlwind of panic. I tried to stay calm, but how could I? My daughter was dying in front of me. I didn't know if she would make it. But the worst part? The part that made my stomach turn and my blood run cold, standing a few feet away from us, as if she had no care in the world, was Karen. She wasn't moving. She wasn't helping. She wasn't even panicking. She was just standing there, her cold eyes fixed on me, watching as if she were a spectator, as if this was all part of some sick game. And in her hand, her cold, lifeless hand, was a gun. It didn't register at first. I didn't fully understand. But when it hit me, when I processed the horrifying reality that Karen had done this, it was like the ground beneath me cracked open. Karen. HOA Karen. The woman who had always been a nuisance, the woman who made life hard for everyone, had just shot my daughter. And she was standing there, unmoved, with no sign of regret on her face. I felt an overwhelming surge of rage, but it was quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming fear I felt for Emma. The rest of the world faded away, and all I could see was her, my baby girl, fighting for her life, bleeding out on the playground that was supposed to be a safe place. I was her protector, and I had failed. My heart pounded as I knelt down beside Emma, my hands trembling so badly that I could barely touch her. I could feel the blood draining from my face as I quickly assessed her injuries. Her body was limp, almost lifeless, and her skin had turned an unnatural shade of pale. My mind was racing. This couldn't be happening. My little girl, lying here, bleeding on the playground. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to be. Her eyes were wide with terror. The fear in her gaze sent a jolt through my chest. She was scared. I could see it. She could feel it too. And that made everything worse. She clutched her chest, her tiny hands trembling, struggling to get air into her lungs. The blood on the ground around her was a stark contrast to the bright colors of the playground, a harsh reminder of the unimaginable reality unfolding before me. Mom, I can't, I can't breathe, Emma whispered between ragged breaths, her voice so small, so fragile, it cut through me like a knife. My heart shattered. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay. I wanted to hold her close and make it all go away. But the reality was far more brutal than I could have ever prepared for. I scrambled for my phone, my fingers shaking as I unlocked it, trying to focus on the screen, on the numbers I needed to dial. I punched in 911, my breath shallow, my mind racing, trying to stay calm despite the panic building in my chest. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end was calm, professional. But to me, it felt distant, as if I were hearing it through a fog. I could barely get the words out. I tried to keep my voice steady, tried to form a sentence, but all I could hear was my daughter's desperate gasps for air. It was as if everything else in the world had faded into a blur. My daughter, she's been shot at the park. Please hurry. My voice broke as I finally got the words out, the panic choking me. I didn't know if I was speaking clearly, if the dispatcher even understood me. I didn't care. I just wanted help. I just needed to get Emma to safety. The weight of the situation hit me in full force. The realization that Karen of all people, had shot my daughter. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some tragic accident. This was deliberate. Karen had aimed at my baby and pulled the trigger. The anger inside me surged, but I couldn't let it take over. Not yet. I turned to look at her, Karen. My body went cold at the sight of her. There she was, standing there in the same place she'd been moments before, as though nothing had happened. She was looking at us, but there was no sign of remorse. No fear. No guilt. Her expression was empty, cold, like she had just done something as ordinary as slamming a door or making a phone call. Karen. I shouted, my voice breaking with the rage I could barely contain. What the hell did you do? Why? Why would you shoot my daughter? She didn't answer me. Not a word. Not a flinch. Just cold eyes staring back at me, unblinking. Her hand was still holding the gun. It was a surreal moment. How was this even possible? The woman who had caused so many problems in our neighborhood, who had controlled and intimidated everyone around her, was now standing in front of me, the one responsible for shattering my world. And she wasn't even reacting. I could feel the heat of my anger rising inside me. I wanted to scream, to run toward her and demand answers, but I couldn't. Emma needed me. My daughter needed me. I turned back to Emma, kneeling beside her again, my hands shaking as I held her, trying to comfort her as best as I could. She was gasping for air, her little chest heaving in a frantic rhythm. The blood beneath her was growing darker, spreading, and my mind couldn't focus on anything else. I could barely breathe myself as I tried to keep her still, to keep her from panicking. Please, honey, please stay with me, I begged, my voice trembling. I need you to stay with me. Help is coming, baby. Just breathe. Every second felt like an eternity. Every breath Emma took felt like a fragile hope, and I was desperately holding on to it. I could hear the sirens in the distance, growing louder as the paramedics rushed to us. But it felt like they would never get here. Like everything was slipping further away with each passing second. Minutes felt like hours. My head was spinning, but I didn't have time to think about it. I could feel the cold sweat on my forehead, my hands still shaking uncontrollably. Every movement, every sound, felt like it was in slow motion. The fear, the helplessness, I couldn't escape it. Then the paramedics arrived. The moment they stepped onto the scene, it was like a wave of relief washed over me. They were professionals, calm and focused, moving quickly to assess Emma's condition. I stepped back, my hands still trembling as they took control. They didn't waste any time. They immediately began stabilizing her, placing an oxygen mask over her face, checking her vitals, getting her on a stretcher. They worked quickly, efficiently, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. I couldn't help but feel some semblance of hope as I saw their professionalism. But my mind was still racing. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the paramedics rushed Emma away. I wanted to follow. I wanted to be with her every step of the way, but I was left standing there, frozen, unable to move. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and the shock was sinking in, a heavy weight that seemed to smother me. I turned back toward Karen, who was still standing there, eerily calm, staring at me. The police were already approaching her, asking questions, but she didn't seem concerned. There was no panic in her eyes, no remorse. Just that same coldness, like nothing had happened. I watched as the police tried to talk to her, but it was clear from the start. No one believed her story. She wasn't panicking, and she wasn't trying to explain herself. It was as if she was acting like nothing was wrong, like she was above it all. The witnesses, the evidence, the video from the security cameras, it had all caught everything. Karen was done. There was no getting out of this. I could hear the officers talking to her, their voices growing more serious, but I didn't care to listen. I had only one thing on my mind. Emma, my little girl, was in critical condition, and Karen? She wasn't even showing any signs of regret. It hit me then, this was no ordinary crime. This was something darker, something deeper. Karen hadn't just shot my daughter, she had done it with intent, without hesitation. And there was no way I was going to let her walk away from this. She would face the consequences of her actions, and I would make sure of it. By the time we arrived at the hospital, my mind was a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and raw fear. Emma was rushed into surgery almost immediately. The doctors took charge, quickly moving with purpose, but every second felt like an eternity. I stayed by her side as long as I could, the sterile smell of the hospital mixing with the steady hum of medical equipment around us. The sounds of the machines, the beeping of her heart rate monitor, and the busy shuffle of the hospital staff only heightened the heavy silence in my chest. All I could think about was Emma. Was she going to be okay? Could she survive this? The doctors had told me she was in critical condition but stable enough to undergo surgery. I clung to that sliver of hope, even as the harsh reality of what had happened began to settle in. My daughter had been shot in broad daylight by someone I thought I knew, someone who lived in our community and was supposed to care about its safety. But now Karen, the HOA president, had done this. She had shot my daughter, and nothing in the world could prepare me for the anger that was building inside me. I couldn't help but replay the moments before the shooting over and over in my mind. Karen had stood there, cold and detached, without even the slightest hint of fear. She hadn't flinched when she pulled the trigger, and when Emma fell, she hadn't moved. She hadn't reacted. Her face, even from a distance, was completely devoid of emotion. It was as if nothing had happened at all, as if it were just another mundane task. How could someone be so cold? How could they do something so horrific without a single sign of remorse? My mind raced with these questions, and the anger I felt toward Karen deepened with each passing second. The police had arrived at the park shortly after the ambulance left with Emma. Their response was swift, and it didn't take long for them to begin investigating. They began by speaking to witnesses and securing the scene. But the key piece of evidence, the thing that would tell the whole truth, was the security footage from the park. The park had cameras installed for just this sort of thing, something we never thought we'd need until that moment. The footage, which was still fresh, clearly showed everything. I was informed the next morning that the footage had been reviewed. The police had already seen what happened. They told me it was irrefutable. There was no mistaking what the cameras had captured. Karen had pulled the gun out, aimed directly at Emma, and fired. The video didn't lie. It clearly showed Karen making a conscious decision, aiming her weapon, and shooting my daughter without hesitation. There was no confusion about intent. She had shot her on purpose. And yet, when the police confronted Karen, she denied it all. I couldn't believe it at first. How could she deny it? The evidence was right there. The video was clear. And yet Karen stood there with her head held high, claiming it was an accident. I didn't mean to, she said, her voice cold. I thought I was aiming at someone else. I didn't intend for this to happen. She went on to say that she had mistaken Emma for someone else, someone she believed was threatening her, someone she thought was an intruder. She even claimed that the gun had just gone off in the chaos. The absurdity of her lies hit me like a slap across the face. How dare she? How could she stand there looking me in the eye and lie so effortlessly? How could she pretend like she wasn't the one who pulled that trigger? The video was right there. There was no mistaking it. The footage showed Karen's cold, calculating actions. The video showed her taking aim, the unmistakable motion of her hand raising the gun, and then the recoil as the shot rang out. There was no panic in her eyes, no confusion. She knew exactly what she was doing. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. She had decided to pull the trigger. I couldn't understand how she could act so unaffected, so composed, when she had just done something unspeakable. It felt like a slap in the face, hearing her talk about it like it was just some misunderstanding. She was trying to rewrite the story, to make herself the victim, to make the shooting seem like some random, unfortunate event. But the truth was plain as day. Karen had shot my daughter on purpose. The police officers, while sympathetic, seemed to know it too. They were doing their jobs, asking her the right questions, trying to piece together her story. But the evidence was clear. Karen's lies didn't hold up. The footage didn't lie, and no amount of excuses could change what had happened. But even as they questioned her, I could see that the process was slow. Karen was still walking around. She wasn't in handcuffs yet. She wasn't being detained. The investigation was moving forward, yes, but it felt like it was happening in slow motion. Every day felt like another day where she was walking free, where the justice my daughter deserved was still out of reach. It wasn't just the fact that Karen had shot Emma. It was the way she was behaving afterward, the complete absence of remorse or guilt. That was what cut the deepest. She hadn't just wounded my daughter, she had shattered everything we knew about safety, about trust. But even more than that, Karen was still walking around, still acting like she was untouchable. Every time I saw her in the news or heard a report about her denying the charges, the anger inside me swelled. She was still trying to spin this into something it wasn't. She was trying to make it seem like she was the one in the right, like she had done nothing wrong. And it felt like the world was listening to her, giving her space to continue these lies while my daughter was in surgery fighting for life. I spent hours pacing, my mind racing with thoughts of Karen's denial. How could she look at herself in the mirror and believe her own lies? How could she live with herself after what she had done? My anger was so consuming that I couldn't focus on anything else. The longer Karen was allowed to lie, the more I felt the distance between us and the justice we deserved. The investigation, though moving slowly, was relentless. The police were gathering more evidence. They were speaking to witnesses, following up on the report, and digging deeper into Karen's past. But the truth was clear, and Karen's lies would eventually be exposed. But in the meantime, I was left to watch as she continued to walk free, acting like nothing had changed. The trial came quickly, too quickly in some ways, and yet it felt like we had been waiting forever. Karen, still walking free after the police investigation, now stood before a courtroom. But this time, she couldn't escape the truth. The stakes were high, the atmosphere thick with tension, and the entire community seemed to hold its breath as the proceedings began. I had never been through a trial like this. I'd seen countless criminal cases in my career, but nothing prepared me for the weight of this one. It wasn't just my daughter's life hanging in the balance. It was a battle for justice, for the truth to finally come to light. And in this moment, Karen couldn't hide behind her position or her lies anymore. The courtroom was a mix of anxious anticipation and quiet grief. People from our neighborhood filled the seats, their faces set in grim determination. I sat in the front row, my eyes locked on Karen as she sat across from me, her expression a mask of cool indifference. The coldness in her eyes made my stomach turn. But it wasn't just that. It was the knowledge that despite everything, she still had the nerve to act as if she were the victim in this situation. She was the one who had pulled the trigger. She was the one who had ruined our lives. And yet, there she was sitting there unrepentant, her gaze unwavering. The prosecution wasted no time. They immediately brought the most damning piece of evidence to the forefront, the video footage. The security cameras at the park had captured every moment of the shooting, from the moment Karen walked up to the swings to the exact moment she pulled the trigger and shot my daughter. It was clear. There was no denying it. The footage was brutal, stark, and irrefutable. As the video played for the court, I could feel the tension mount. There on the screen was Karen's face frozen in time, her eyes cold and calculating as she aimed the gun. The shot rang out, and I watched as Emma, my sweet, innocent little girl, crumpled to the ground. I could barely breathe as I watched, the horror of that moment rushing back to me like a wave. I could hear Emma's scream in my head, feel the helplessness and fear that had gripped my heart in that instant. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen, even though it felt like my soul was being ripped open all over again. What struck me most wasn't the violence of the shooting, it was the utter lack of emotion in Karen's face. She didn't flinch. She didn't panic. There was no sign of regret, no sign of anything resembling empathy. She aimed, fired, and stood there as Emma fell to the ground, watching as my daughter's blood stained the ground beneath her. It was pure malice, cold, calculated, and unforgiving. Karen's defense team tried to spin the narrative, of course. They tried to convince the jury that it had been a moment of panic, that the gun had gone off by accident. They claimed that Karen hadn't intended to shoot Emma, that she had mistakenly thought my daughter was a threat. But the video didn't lie. Karen's actions were deliberate. The evidence was clear. She had aimed at Emma. She had fired. There was no mistaking it. There was no room for doubt. The defense attorney was grasping at straws. They tried to claim that Karen had acted in self-defense, that she was reacting to something she had perceived as a threat. But everyone in that courtroom could see the truth. Karen had never been in any danger. She had fired at a child who was simply playing on the swings, someone who had no idea what was happening until it was too late. The prosecution was relentless. They painted a picture of Karen's true nature, how she had used her position as the HOA president to control the lives of everyone around her, how she had manipulated the neighborhood into submission, and how she had let that power corrupt her. The video footage, the testimony from witnesses, and the evidence all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Karen had shot my daughter, and she had done so with intent. The tension in the courtroom grew as the closing arguments were made. The defense clung to their narrative, but it was clear no one was buying it. Karen's actions spoke louder than any words could. The video didn't lie. The witnesses didn't lie. The facts were undeniable. When the jury left to deliberate, time seemed to stretch endlessly. My mind raced, my stomach knotted. Would they see what I saw? Would they understand the gravity of Karen's actions? Would they bring the justice Emma and our family so desperately needed? The wait felt like an eternity. Every moment that passed felt like a moment stolen from my daughter's life, from her future. I had spent so many sleepless nights wondering if we would ever get justice, wondering if Karen would ever truly pay for what she had done. And as the jury returned to the courtroom, I held my breath. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen last name, guilty of attempted murder. The words rang through the courtroom, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It wasn't just a relief for me. It was a relief for Emma, for everyone who had witnessed what Karen had done. For the first time in months, I felt like we were finally on the road to healing. But even in that moment of triumph, the reality of what had happened hit me again. Karen's actions had shattered something deep inside me. She had stolen a part of my daughter's innocence, a part of my peace. She had taken away the safety of a place that should have been one of the most innocent and carefree in our lives, a playground. The sentencing phase of the trial came swiftly. Karen's defense team tried to argue for leniency, but the judge wasn't having it. He was firm in his decision, making it clear that Karen's actions had been unforgivable. She had taken a life, not physically, but emotionally and mentally. The trauma she had caused Emma, the pain she had inflicted on our family, it would stay with us forever. And for that, Karen would pay. The judge sentenced Karen to life in prison for attempted murder with no possibility of parole. The courtroom was quiet, the weight of the verdict settling over everyone like a thick fog. I felt a relief, yes, but it was a bittersweet relief. The emotional scars would stay with us forever. Emma would never be the same, and neither would I. But at least Karen was paying for what she had done. At least she couldn't hurt anyone else. As the officers led Karen away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but watch her. There was no remorse in her eyes, no regret. She wasn't even looking at me or at Emma. She was walking away as though nothing had happened. But the truth was clear. Karen had fallen, and now the world knew her for who she really was. In the end, justice had prevailed, but the damage had already been done. The emotional weight of that day would never leave us. It wasn't just about Karen's conviction, it was about what we had lost, what had been stolen from us in the blink of an eye. The aftermath of Karen's sentencing was a mixture of relief and sorrow. The courtroom was no longer a space of tension, but there was still an emptiness that lingered, like a scar that had healed on the surface, but still ached beneath. Emma, my brave daughter, was physically recovering, thank God, but the emotional scars she carried were deep, more painful than any injury I could see. She had witnessed something that no child should ever have to see, let alone experience. And while the doctors had patched up her wounds, the trauma that had been inflicted on her would take much longer to heal. I remember the first night we were home after the trial. Emma was curled up next to me in bed, her small body trembling as she fought to fall asleep. I could feel the weight of the fear in her chest, the tension that wouldn't let her rest. Her body was healing, her broken ribs, the gunshot wound on her side. All of that would eventually fade. But the nightmares, the anxiety, the constant fear that someone else might hurt her, those things couldn't be stitched up with bandages. They would take time, and they would take patience. I stayed by her side through every moment, doing my best to remind her of the beauty in the world, the things she had once loved. We would go outside and walk in the park, where everything had changed so quickly. She would sit at the swings again, but this time she would cling to my side, her eyes scanning the area nervously, as if she expected danger to be lurking around every corner. She had become a different child in some ways, more cautious, more aware of the world's darker side. But in the quiet moments, I could still see glimpses of the girl she once was, the joyful, fearless Emma, who loved to play, who loved to laugh. Slowly, those moments became more frequent. Slowly, she began to trust again. Not just the world around her, but herself. She was learning to believe that she could be safe, that the world wasn't filled with people like Karen. And that healing, even in the smallest steps, was everything. There were times when Emma would talk about it, her voice shaky, her words slow and hesitant. But I let her. I let her speak, even when it was hard for me to hear. She would tell me how scared she had been when the shot rang out, how everything felt so unreal, how she didn't understand why Karen had done it. I would hold her hand, and I would listen, because I knew this was her way of working through the trauma. I knew that the only way to truly heal was to acknowledge the pain, to confront it head-on. Some nights, when the weight of it all felt like too much, I would just sit with her. We wouldn't speak. We didn't need to. I would hold her close, and she would fall asleep in my arms, the steady rhythm of her breathing bringing me a peace I didn't realize I needed. She was alive. She was safe. And together, we would get through this. The healing was slow, painfully slow at times. But I began to notice the little changes. The way Emma smiled a little wider, the way she started playing again with her toys, the way she finally returned to the park with a little less fear in her heart. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but we were getting there. And that was what mattered. As for the neighborhood, it too began to shift. Karen's arrest and sentencing had been the catalyst for change. For years, she had terrorized the community, enforcing ridiculous rules, making unreasonable demands, and using her position to intimidate people into submission. But now, with her gone, the air seemed to clear. The reign of terror that Karen had imposed was over, and people who had once lived in fear of her began to breathe freely again. There was no more worrying about receiving a random fine for something as small as the color of your fence or being harassed for a minor infraction. People who had stayed quiet for so long finally started to speak up, finally started to take control of their own lives again. The HOA meetings, once filled with tension, were now peaceful. People actually talked without fear of retribution. Neighbors began to gather again, talking to each other as friends instead of as potential targets of Karen's petty enforcement. It was a strange feeling, one that I didn't think I would ever experience again after all the years of dealing with Karen's dominance. The power she had held over the neighborhood was gone, and in its place was a sense of camaraderie, a renewed sense of unity. Still, even with all the relief, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost that would never truly be recovered. Karen may have been gone, but the scars she left were more than just physical. The neighborhood would never be the same. Trust had been broken. A sense of safety had been shattered. We had all been changed by what she had done, and while things were improving, they were far from perfect. I couldn't help but reflect on how close we had come to losing everything. Emma could have died that day. She could have been taken from me in an instant just like that. The thought haunted me more than I cared to admit. I had always been careful, always vigilant, but there had been nothing I could do to prevent Karen's actions. She had taken something from us, something that could never be repaired. The terror of that moment, of seeing my daughter on the ground, of hearing that gunshot, was something I would carry with me forever. But despite all the pain, despite everything we had lost, we had survived. And that was all that mattered. Emma was still here. She was alive. And though the scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal, she was still the same brave, beautiful girl who had brought so much light into my life. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could help her find her way back to the joy that had once defined her. And together we would rebuild. The neighborhood, too, would rebuild. It would take time. But as I watched the residents begin to reclaim their lives, I knew that the future was still bright for us all. Karen's legacy was one of fear, but the future? The future would be one of resilience, of strength, and of community. In the end, I realized that the journey to healing wasn't just about Emma. It was about all of us. It was about finding our strength in the aftermath of trauma and learning to live again, to trust again. And as I looked at my daughter, her smile slowly returning as she played in the park again, I knew we were on the right path. The healing had begun. And though the scars would remain, they would no longer define us. As the weeks stretched into months, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle into something more manageable, though never fully gone. Emma, my brave daughter, continued her healing journey. Physically, she was stronger with each passing day, but emotionally, the road ahead remained uncertain. Yet, despite the residual fear and anxiety that sometimes gripped her, there was a quiet strength that began to resurface, one that made me believe more than ever that she would make it through this. As a mother, it felt impossible to fully express the weight I carried, a burden of both grief and determination. I had held her while she cried, I had comforted her when the memories of that horrible day crept in, and I had watched her struggle to reclaim a sense of normalcy. But I had also seen the courage in her. I had seen how in the darkest of moments she had clung to me, but also to the hope of tomorrow. And as time went on, I began to see glimmers of the girl she had been before, laughing at something silly on TV, running outside to play with her friends, and even daring to venture back to the park where it had all started. Slowly, we were both learning to breathe again. But healing wasn't just about Emma's recovery. It was about us, our family, coming together in the aftermath of something no family should ever have to endure. I had learned so much through this nightmare. I had learned how deep love can run, how far a mother would go to protect her child, but I had also learned something about resilience. The trauma of that day of Karen's actions was not going to define us. What would define us was our ability to move forward, to rebuild not just our lives, but our strength together. I looked at Emma one day as she was playing with her dolls, a look of concentration on her face, and I realized how much she had changed, not in a bad way, but in a way that had been forged in fire. She was no longer just the sweet, innocent girl who laughed in the face of the world. She had become someone who understood the weight of life, someone who had been touched by the darkest corners of human experience, but who had found the light again. And that resilience, that ability to fight back against fear, against trauma, it was hers now. And it was mine too. We both carried scars. I had seen the look in Emma's eyes when she flinched at the sound of a loud noise, when she hesitated at the sight of a gun, or anything that reminded her of that day. And I felt it too, in the deep places of my heart. But as much as we both carried those scars, they didn't define us. They didn't own us. Karen had tried to break us. She had tried to destroy the very foundation of who we were, to steal away our joy and our peace. But instead of shattering us, her actions had only made us stronger. We had stood together, and we had weathered the storm. The pain, the fear, the helplessness, it all made us who we were now. It made us resilient. I remember the first time Emma smiled freely again, the first time I saw her laugh without any hint of hesitation or fear. It wasn't that we had forgotten what had happened, but we had learned to reclaim our lives. We had learned that while the past could never be erased, it didn't have to dictate our future. The community, too, had found a new strength. Karen's absence had left a void, but it was a void filled with something better, unity. For years, the people in our neighborhood had lived in the shadow of her control. No one had dared to speak up, no one had dared to stand up against her, because she was always there, always lurking, always with the power to make life difficult. But once she was gone, the air seemed to clear. People who had once been too afraid to speak now voiced their concerns, their hopes, their needs. The HOA became a place of cooperation instead of oppression. The division that Karen had sowed was slowly being replaced by a sense of community, and that was the most important thing. I had no doubt that Emma would carry her strength with her into adulthood. This experience would shape her. Yes, but it would also give her the tools to face whatever came next. She would always be strong. She would always know what it meant to survive. As for me, I found myself becoming a different person too. The old me, the one who would have rushed to fix everything to make sure the pain disappeared, had given way to a more patient version of myself. I had learned that healing couldn't be rushed, and that it was okay to take things one step at a time. It was okay to not have all the answers, to not have everything figured out immediately. What mattered most was that we were moving forward. Karen had taken so much from us, and yet, in the end, she had given us something too, a newfound appreciation for what we had, for each other, for the community we were building. She had forced us to acknowledge the darkest parts of ourselves, but she had also shown us that we were capable of rising above them. The world might throw its worst at us, but it would never break us. We were survivors. The final word in this story was not Karen's. She had tried to control our lives, to make us live in fear, but in the end, she had failed. The final word belonged to Emma and me. We had survived the unimaginable, and we had come out on the other side stronger. There would always be moments of doubt, moments when the memories crept back in, but those moments wouldn't define us. Our strength, our resilience, that was what would define us. And together, we would move forward. As Emma played in the yard that afternoon, her laughter filling the air, I watched her with a renewed sense of pride. She was no longer the same girl who had been caught in the crossfire of a nightmare. She was a warrior. She was my little girl, the one I had fought to protect, and she was finally finding her way back to herself. I had no illusions that everything was perfect, that the past would be erased. The scars we carried would always be there, but they were no longer the first thing we saw when we looked at each other. We had been through the worst, and we had made it out. That was all that mattered. The future, though unknown and uncertain, was full of possibilities. And whatever it held, I knew one thing for sure: we were ready for it. If this story touched you, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in my place? Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another gripping, heart-pounding story like this one. Drop your city's name in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and always protect the ones you love. Justice is powerful, but the resilience of a family fighting together is unstoppable. Thank you for being a part of this journey with me. Until next time, stay safe and keep watching.